Dear Jeremy Crawford and the Dungeons & Dragons team, you certainly will have no idea who I am, so let me introduce myself. My name is also Jeremy, and I absolutely love Dungeons & Dragons. It has been a passion of mine for years and has allowed me to retain connections with friends and family across cities and countries and even through the pandemic. A sentiment that I'm sure resonates throughout this community. This game means so much to me, and that's why I want it to be the absolute best that it can be. Since the announcement of One D&D and the first playtest materials were released in August, I have been absolutely obsessed with it, and I have to say that I am incredibly excited for many of the changes already presented, and am eagerly awaiting more. I was very much inspired by Chris's open letter when writing this, and while I know the best forum for feedback are the surveys, this just feels a bit too broad to fit there. While Chris's letter did ask some very important questions, some of which we even got the answers to, it didn't ask some of the questions that I and many other members of the community have been wondering about. As a result, the focus of this letter is not really to question specific character choices or the minutiae of balance, but rather the focus of this letter is to pose bigger picture questions that will impact those smaller scale changes. I hope that this will lead to some clarity about where this playtest and Dungeons & Dragons is headed. Crucially though, I don't want to get into a habit of bombarding you with open letters, I just wanted to get my thoughts out on this topic. Everything in this letter is suggested in good faith and with good intentions. I'm not intending to be overly critical or mean-spirited. I simply have some questions that have been on my mind for a few months. From the word go, it was made clear that whatever form One D&D takes in 2024, that it would be backwards compatible with all 5th edition sourcebooks. I have some questions about that. To set the framework for why I believe this is important, I feel that this promise of backwards compatibility, while it might not seem like it, informs many of the design decisions that can be taken in One D&D's final form, and, just as importantly, fundamentally underpins the value proposition of any new content released between August 2022 and the eventual release of One D&D in 2024. To tackle the first point, I would just like to set a definition of backward compatibility so we can establish what the stated ultimate design goal for One D&D is. Backward compatibility is a premise which allows for something from a new system to be interoperable with an older version of itself, ideally as gracefully as possible. For our purposes, this means allowing 5e content to work in the context of One D&D as cleanly as possible. With that out of the way, the question then becomes, to what extent will One D&D be backward compatible with 5th edition? Obviously, anything can be backwards compatible with anything else given enough effort, and that strikes at the root of what I'm getting at. How much work will running a backwards compatible adventure be? And if it is even possible, how can you ensure that the challenge level will be at least roughly equal? Or will it not be? Is it enough for you to simply say that it works without any real consideration to the impact that this will have when trying to execute it? This ties in nicely to the topic of Dungeon Master options, which is something I will discuss a little bit later. For the moment though, we were promised backwards compatibility, but it feels as though the successful execution of that seems to erode with each unearthed arcana. Or perhaps we have very different definitions of what backwards compatibility is. Or maybe your team hasn't even thoroughly considered this question yet. These questions aren't intended to be snide or rhetorical, we simply don't have the answers to what your vision for backward compatibility truly means and how you intend to execute on it. And, as a result, while it might not seem like it matters, this question of backward compatibility will actually have a significant impact on both our ability to playtest and your ability to present new options. What concerns me is that maintaining backward compatibility comes with significant costs, mainly resource planning, design limitations, and implementations. In your own words, One D&D is not a new addition, but rather represents an opportunity to grow and expand the game we all love with each new product. With that in mind, over time, One D&D will continue to deviate and grow farther and farther from where it left 5th edition. So what does that mean? Are you going to be dedicating resources to ensuring that something like Curse of Strahd or Storm King's Thunder don't suddenly stop working gracefully within the confines of One D&D? Or is the promise of backward compatibility really only meant to serve as a stopgap for a year or two to simply not alienate new players before any remnant of 5e is left to fade to obscurity? Or, most concerningly, is maintaining backward compatibility going to prevent meaningful growth or development of the game moving forward? With the release of each product and with each passing year, it's going to become increasingly difficult to ensure backwards compatibility, and it would be a true shame if that prevented your design team from implementing some unique or game-changing ideas. Designing for 2 editions simultaneously is objectively more difficult than designing for 1 edition. What I fear is that there may be some feature or idea or mechanic that, for whatever reason, would not work if trying to run a 5e adventure in One D&D, and that holds you back from implementing it in the future. How do you avoid that? For example, if a legacy adventure called for the use of a particular mechanic, but that mechanic either no longer exists in 1D&D or has fundamentally changed to the point that it no longer provides the desired effect, would that prevent you from implementing it? I can't help but feel like I would rather backwards compatibility not be made a priority if it comes at the expense of the game's future. This leads me quite nicely into my next question, which is what is happening for every release between August 2022 and the eventual release of 1D&D? The buy-in for these books is largely something that has been predicated on the overarching theme of this letter, the promise of backward compatibility. We recently had the release of Dragonlance, Shadow of the Dragon Queen, and have another 5 official books scheduled for release in 2023. How do you reconcile the release of new options in these books with the release of 1D&D less than a year later and its ongoing playtest? Can we assume that any new options presented in these books will not be receiving any changes or overhauls for 2024? If this is the case, then it seems like more is set in stone about the release of 1D&D than we realize, and this can heavily influence our survey responses, how we playtest, and what we can anticipate in future Unearthed Arcanas. Or do you plan to keep options at a bare minimum for each book? In which case, the value proposition for any of these releases just feels lackluster and like they're being held back due to another, larger, impending release. Or will it just be business as usual for these releases? As in, any content or options provided will be printed as if 1D&D was not right around the corner. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I am sure that I'm not alone when I say that the answer to them is important. It will inform not only my purchase decisions, but also how I consider and evaluate every new release in the context of 1D&D, and by extension, how I playtest and submit feedback. Something I touched on earlier and wanted to circle back to is the question of Dungeon Master options. This is something tangentially related to both backward compatibility and the upcoming releases for 2023. So far, nearly everything we have seen for 1D&D has been player focused rather than DM focused, and to a large extent, I understand and appreciate that. The vast majority of people playing this game are players and not dungeon masters. You have hinted and teased at some things to come, such as improved guidance for balancing encounters, but what runs through the back of my mind is whether or not this will also be held back by maintaining support for 5th edition. What we have seen so far for character options in most cases indicates a fairly significant departure from progression in 5th edition versus 1D&D. Classes like the Cleric are getting their subclass much later, while other classes like the Bard and Ranger have not only seen a massive change to most of their features, but also when those features are received. This has had the side effect of fairly significantly altering the power curve of the classes between the two versions. You stated that throughout the course of this playtest, we'll be seeing 48 subclasses across the 12 classes in the game. Presumably, this omits the Artificer. However, there are, by my count at least, 116 currently printed official subclasses, or 112 if we omit the 4 from the Artificer. Obviously, over time you will release more and more subclasses, and I'm sure that they won't all just be updated reprints, but rather new and innovative ideas, and that is super exciting. But again, it has me wondering, how can you simultaneously balance for legacy classes and modern 1D&D ones in the case of someone playing an older subclass in a 1D&D adventure? Or do you simply not and leave that to the DM? In which case, will we be getting tools to help us balance for that too? Since we're on the topic of DM tools, I would love if we can get some way to help support running D&D campaigns into the higher levels. I really like that class capstones have been brought down to 18th level, and now we receive epic boons at 20th level, as it provides players the opportunity to use things that most have probably never experienced before, but the trouble is actually getting a campaign to that point. My regular weekly campaign is currently at 16th level, and I can say that once they hit 12th or 13th, the game has become, for lack of a better term, insanity. Now, for us, it's working. We are having fun experiencing this together and are loving it. But I won't lie, DMing for a group of 16th level characters is complicated and time consuming. Playing at high levels and using these amazing high challenge rating monsters is such an incredible and surreal experience that it's such a shame that more players don't get to try these things out more often in a way that actually feels manageable. Tangents aside, I hope that my main premise has remained clear. The promise of backward compatibility has likely come with some unintended expectations for the past, present, and future of the game. It has the potential to paint your team into a design corner that may be difficult to get out of as a result of the limitations imposed by this promise. I will say that any semblance of backward compatibility for a game of this scale will be a truly impressive feat, and that's why I feel that it is really important to set clear boundaries surrounding it to manage all of our expectations moving forward, and provide a clearer design framework for which you can work from. I'm not saying that backward compatibility is the biggest hurdle to the ultimate success of 1D&D, I really don't believe that. What I am saying is that it certainly is something worthy of heavy consideration and open discussion with the community. Ultimately, I'm not in the room where any of these decisions are made, and this entire discussion is based on the limited perspective that I have as a player, dungeon master, and fan. I trust that you and your team will make the right decision to best support us. If you or someone on your team somehow manages to see or read this letter, I want to sincerely thank you for the time and effort that you put into this game. The work that you put in has culminated in millions of people having some of the most engaging and memorable experiences of their lives, and there is simply no replacement for that. I look forward to the next UA and seeing what you come up with. Sincerely, Jeremy.